So as you know, Sherlock Holmes is one of the most admired and critiqued and recreated series in the history of detective fiction. Which is wild because I think in the actual canon there are only 4 full-length novels. There's like a bunch of short stories and things that he's written, but Doyle himself, only wrote 4 novels, and each of those novels is considered a classic of British literature. So obviously when you write something that influential, people are going to react. And one of the writers who reacted to it was a French one called Maurice LeBlanc, who created this gentleman thief called Arsène Lupin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but let's hope so. And obviously he needed, some sort of nemesis for the character because he's a burglar. And he decided, who better than the great British detective Sherlock Holmes. So he started writing all these novels with Sherlock Holmes as a character in it, and obviously Doyle got the wind up and he filed a legal complaint, and he said, LeBlanc isn't allowed to use my character, which is still under copyright. So LeBlanc thought about it and he got back to Doyle with the most French reaction ever. He said, fine, you don't want me to use the name of your character, I won't do it. I have now renamed that character to Sherlock Holmes. I love that so much. It is so brilliantly petty. And it kind of got me thinking about literary feuds and how people just behave really badly with each other when they're in the same profession. And so I thought I would talk about 4 of my favorite literary feuds. So first up is a perennial favorite, Salman Rushdie. I don't know any other person who has expended this amount of energy in feuds with other people. I'm not going to make a joke about Iran because I get it, that was deadly serious. But think about it, he pissed off entire governments. That's some rare talent. And then, it's kind of like giving matches to an arsonist. Somebody told him to get on Twitter. I like to think of Rushdie's publicist sort of gnashing their teeth and stabbing themselves repeatedly in the thigh with a fork when they found out, because my God, if there is ever a man who should not be on social media, it's Salman Rushdie. I think he spends most of his time on Twitter, getting into fights with his critics and with the New York Times. I don't think there's a single reviewer for the New York Times with whom he hasn't gotten into a blood feud. But my favorite is the feud that he got into with John Updike when Updike reviewed one of his books for the New Yorker, and it wasn't a very good review. So the review opened with Updike questioning Rushdie's decision to name his lead character Maximilian Ophuls after, I assume, the German director, even though the character had nothing to do with the real life Ophuls. So I think the first line of the review was, why, oh why, is this character named such? And a couple of months later, somebody went up to Rushdie, and that journalist knew exactly what he was doing, or he or she was doing, when they went up to Rushdie and asked him, what did he think of Updike's review of his work in the New Yorker? And Rushdie, he said, why, oh why did I name my character that? Well, I don't know. A name is just a name sometimes. Somewhere in Las Vegas, there's probably a male prostitute called John Updike. And men like to say women are catty. Next up is the rivalry between John Keats and Lord Byron from the 19th century. Now, I don't really have a team here because, I actually don't have a team in any of these feuds because they're all pretty terrible people. But Keats and Byron were both poets and they wrote around the same time, but they were from very different social stratas and were either very jealous of each other's work or very dismissive. Nobody really knows why they took such a hate to each other, but they really did. And Byron, to be honest, he did have a lot of drama in his life. I think he's one of those people who just lived for drama, and that's what sort of fueled his muse. So Keats apparently thought that Byron's success was mostly because he was rich and privileged. I mean, he was Lord Byron, he was an hereditary peer. When one of Byron's books did really well, he apparently remarked to a friend, you see what it does to be 6 foot tall and a lord, because Byron was also very famously handsome. Byron was also childishly petty. And Keats unfortunately died at age 25 of consumption or tuberculosis or something very 19th century. And right before he had died, one of his books was very badly reviewed, and a lot of his friends, including Shelley, thought that he basically died of a broken heart because he couldn't stand how badly his books had been reviewed. Now, Shelley was also friends with Byron, so obviously I guess Shelley must have mentioned it to him at once. And Byron thought that was hilarious. So he wrote this poem, this incredibly bitchy poem. John Keats, who was killed off by one critique, just as he really promised something great, if not intelligible, without Greek, contrived to talk about the gods of late, much as they might have been supposed to speak. Poor fellow! His was an untoward fate, to strange the mind that very fiery particle should let itself be snuffed out by an article. He's such a little bitch. Now, I obviously can't make a video about literary feuds and not mention Ernest Hemingway. Dude was like the original Papa Bear. He was just in fights with everybody. He was drunk all the time. He was just drama. One of the funniest things that happened was that he and Wallace Stevens, who's like this other author, got into this very public spat, and they would say things about each other to other people, and they would just very clearly make it known that they didn't care for each other. And then at one point, Hemingway had enough, and he learned that Stevens was somewhere in the neighborhood. And at that very moment, Stevens was at this party, and he told his hostess that, oh, I wish that Hemingway was here, because if he was here, I'd just punch him in the nose. And at that straight second, Hemingway showed up and told him to take his best shot. And it was insane because he's a huge dude, Hemingway, and he really ascribed to the cult of masculinity. So he was just super into brawling and stuff. So you can't imagine that you'll go up into a fight with Hemingway and then give him one little punch and then that would be it. No, it would be a proper brawl. So Stevens, to his credit, tried to punch him, and I think he landed a few blows, but Hemingway just punched him back and hit him so hard that Stevens just passed out cold. And then poor Stevens had to go into hiding for a while because his face was black and blue. And then eventually, Hemingway was like, you know what, let's just put it all behind us, because this is what happens between men. And he told Stevens he'd never tell anybody and that they could all put it behind them, and then proceeded to write letters to pretty much everyone he knew, telling them about this time that he fought Stevens and laid him out. Because men are gossips. And if we are talking about legendary feuders, then we have to talk about Gore Vidal. I thought about talking about his feud with Truman Capote because it's one for the ages. Truman Capote once said, I'm always very sad about Gore Vidal. Very sad that he has to breathe every day. I mean, that is some hatred. I mean, it didn't even end with his death. I mean, after Capote died, Vidal said Capote's death was a brilliant career move. I mean, that is something that you really would only say about your worst enemy. So those two men really hated each other. But the thing with Vidal is that he just hated a lot of people, and he was very vocal about all of them. And one of my favorites is the one that he had with Norman Mailer. Vidal really did not like Norman Mailer, and the sentiment was fully returned, and they fought all the time. They sniped back and forth, and they said horrible things about each other. And at one point, Mailer just had enough. And so when both of them were at this party together, Mailer just went up to Vidal and just hit him. Just flat out slugged him in the mouth. Vidal picked himself up and he didn't attempt to attack Mailer at all. He just looked up at Mailer and said, "Once again, words have failed Norman Mailer." You can't fight that kind of absolutely devastating wit with your fists. Like, if Gore Vidal had a hate on for me, I would just be like, you know what, I probably deserve it. I know when I'm beat. So you'll notice that I haven't mentioned any women in this, and that's because I just wanted just drama. And when it comes to drama, honestly, like male writers, women writers have nothing on them. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.